My name is Marcus Lane. I'm 42 years old, and for the last 3.5 years, I've poured my entire life into building Athenor systems from a cluttered garage in Tampa into a software firm people actually trust. When others spent their nights pitching venture capital dreams under dim restaurant lights, I was crawling across dusty concrete floors at 3 a.m., swapping out fried circuits in our homemade server racks, praying nothing else burned out before sunrise. I remember when we first moved into the old warehouse off Iber Street. The roof leaked whenever Florida storms rolled through. Extension cords snaked across cracked tiles like tripwires. Half the time, the coffee maker tripped the breaker, plunging the room into silence broken only by frustrated groans. But we were building something real, not slides, not buzzwords. A system that could help mid-sized logistics companies process shipments in seconds, not hours. Something that made life easier for the small teams hustling to keep their promises every day. I never cared much about flashy titles. CTO, principal architect, they called me whatever sounded impressive to investors that week. What mattered was seeing the data stream clean and fast, with no red error flags lighting up the terminal at 2 in the morning. I remember dozing off on old office chairs, only to be jolted awake by the whir of cooling fans kicking back in after another hardware swap I'd finished an hour earlier. My dad used to say, if you're gonna build something, build it so you'd bet your life on it. He spent 35 years working high steel construction, laying down beams 200 feet in the air. He knew about risks. About responsibility. I carried that with me every time I tightened a cable tie or rechecked the code for vulnerabilities at dawn before anyone else showed up. If you've ever felt that quiet pride, knowing your work holds up the dreams of others, then you'll understand why I kept going, night after night, year after year. Before you hear what happened next, do me a small favor. If this story hits you anywhere in your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it. There are more people out there who need to hear what quiet builders like us face behind corporate walls. The comment came from Adrian Burke during our quarterly review on a foggy Monday morning. He had been with Athenor Systems for precisely 5 months. 5 months. I had been here since day zero, when all we had were folding tables, thrift store chairs, and routers perched on crates. Adrian sat at the head of the conference table like a monarch surveying his kingdom. Maybe he was. The board had brought him in after our Series B funding round, calling it strategic leadership with a fresh lens. He wore slim tailored suits in muted navy and spoke in clipped phrases designed to impress investors. Words like pipeline optimization, cost compression, and market conquest flowed out of him with ease, his voice calm and deliberate, every syllable carrying authority he hadn't yet earned. I watched him flip through his glossy presentation slides. Graphs showing projected growth curves bent steeply upward, color-coded restructuring plans stretched across timelines. My stomach tightened with each bullet point. I'd seen restructuring before. It never meant anything good for people like me. Marcus, your work has been functional, he said, eyes glued to his MacBook, but we need to think bigger, move faster. The old ways are slowing us down. Functional, 3 years of wiring up the entire backend from scratch, writing security protocols line by line under flickering fluorescent lights, patching vulnerabilities before they exploded into PR nightmares, and he called it functional. I didn't speak, I just nodded, scribbling down meeting notes I'd never read again. But as his voice droned on about pivoting to scalable SaaS offerings and offshore dev acceleration, a cold heaviness settled in my chest. Something primal that whispered, pay attention. This is how it begins. I glanced around the room. Most of the new hires looked inspired, nodding along to his corporate sermon. They didn't know the smell of burning wires at 4 a.m. They didn't know the quiet terror of seeing an entire shipment queue vanish because a single misconfigured packet filter took down the data stream. They only knew bright color slides promising them career acceleration and performance bonuses. That morning, Adrian introduced his final slide with a flourish. It showed a simplified org chart, the top half expanding with new management roles. The bottom half, the half where I lived, was shrinking. He called it streamlining operational redundancy. My pulse thumped against my ribs, slow and heavy. I knew then that everything was about to change, and not for the better. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my small corner office, each step echoing with the certainty that my world was about to tilt. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, staring at the worn carpet beneath my boots. That cold heaviness in my chest wasn't fear. It was instinct, survival, the same feeling that made my dad triple-check his safety harness before stepping out onto steel beams 20 stories up. I crossed to my desk, sat down, and pulled up my employment contract from the encrypted folder where I kept all my essentials. The document had been signed nearly 4 years ago, back when Athenor Systems was nothing but a hope lit by desperation. I remembered that day, the folding table, the stale coffee, the founders Jacob Tran and Oscar Ellis trembling with excitement as they handed me the paperwork, grateful I'd agreed to build their system in exchange for equity and a fraction of what my market rate was worth. I scrolled through each clause now with careful, deliberate focus. Back then, I had barely skimmed it. I was just relieved to have steady work after being laid off from an enterprise cloud provider that outsourced half my team to Bangalore. But today, every sentence felt like it pulsed with hidden power. Legal jargon about intellectual property protections, subsections outlining ownership rights for code written prior to full employment conversion. At the time, I didn't care. I had just wanted to build, to matter, to create something that lasted. But reading it now, I realized the truth. I still held the original copyrights on the encryption protocols I wrote during my first 6 months before they converted me from contractor to salaried staff. The contract stated that all software I created before that date remained my intellectual property unless explicitly purchased under a separate acquisition agreement. I searched the database for any such agreement. Nothing. They had never bought it out. In their rush to grow and keep me happy, they had skipped that step entirely. My breathing slowed as lines of code scrolled through my memory, the custom hash algorithms for user credentialing, the deployment key generators designed to bypass standard licensing constraints, the dynamic API connectors linking legacy client systems to our proprietary frameworks. They were all mine, written in my apartment on an old ThinkPad, fueled by instant noodles and burnt coffee. Outside my window, I saw Adrian walking across the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gesturing sharply as if commanding the entire world to obey. I watched him for a long moment. The cold heaviness in my chest shifted into something solid and sharp. Not rage, not vengeance, just quiet resolve. If Adrian Burke thought he could erase 3 years of my life with a single restructure, he was about to learn how deeply those years were rooted into the foundation he was so eager to repaint. That night, long after the last developer shut down their workstation and the cleaning crew began their quiet rounds, I sat alone in my office, the blue glow of dual monitors washing over the scattered notebooks and coffee rings on my desk. My eyes drifted across the framed photo taped to my second screen. It was from our first month as a team, back when Athenor Systems was nothing more than Jacob Tran, Oscar Ellis, and me. In the picture, we stood in front of a rusting garage door in Tampa, grinning like idiots. Oscar's hair was still long then, curling at his collar, and Jacob had that wide-eyed optimism that made him pitch investors with trembling hands. Behind us, the borrowed server racks rattled like angry tin cans whenever we powered up the first build tests. We didn't even have chairs that matched. Half the team sat on folding metal seats from a yard sale, the other half balanced on crates turned upside down. The smell of soldered circuit boards and burnt instant coffee was our daily incense. I remembered the first time Jacob told me about his dream to create a logistics processing platform that small and mid-sized shipping companies could actually afford. Something that wouldn't just pad corporate bottom lines, but would let warehouse foremen in Georgia or supply managers in Arizona breathe, easier knowing their data was secure and lightning fast. No more midnight inventory rechecks, no more lost shipment IDs buried under outdated software protocols. I thought he was naive then, maybe I still do. But I believed in what we were building, even when other developers called me insane for taking equity instead of guaranteed salary. I believed when I spent 90-hour weeks sleeping under my desk, lines of code blurring in my vision until sunrise burned the blinds orange. There was one night in particular I could never forget. It was almost Christmas, and outside the warehouse the Florida night air dropped below freezing, rare for Tampa. The heating unit had died 2 days before, and we were all bundled up in thrift store hoodies, breath fogging with each exhale. Oscar passed out on the conference table, and Jacob snored softly under his desk. I stayed awake, hunched over my ThinkPad, rewriting a core database function that kept corrupting transaction records mid-query. When I finally ran the test suite at 3:44 a.m., the console returned all clears. Processing speeds tripled. I remember staring at the results until tears blurred the screen. Not from exhaustion, though it was there, heavy as concrete on my back, but from relief, from pride, from knowing I had pushed through every failure to build something that actually worked. In the silence of my office now, years later, I let that memory anchor me. The man Adrian Burke dismissed as functional was the same man who rewrote the heartbeat of this company in a freezing warehouse while everyone else slept. That truth pulsed through my veins with each quiet breath, steady and unbreakable. The breakthrough came sometime during our second year, in the suffocating heat of late August. Florida summers had a way of baking the warehouse roof until the old metal sheets radiated warmth down onto us, turning the server room into a sauna, even with 3-box fans whirring at full blast. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead as I stared at a stubborn bottleneck in our data pipeline. Every major client demo up to that point had suffered from latency spikes. When shipment data from multiple distribution centers converged into our system, response times lagged to nearly unusable levels. Jacob called it our Achilles heel. Oscar, ever the optimist, insisted we could optimize the environment by adding more RAM and cooling. But I knew it was deeper than that, a design flaw that hardware couldn't mask forever. For 3 straight days, I slept under my desk, drifting in and out of restless dreams filled with cascading error logs and corrupted JSON strings. I woke up at 2:13 a.m. On the 4th night, heart pounding with an idea so sharp it cut through my exhaustion like cold water. Pulling myself upright, I powered on my ThinkPad and rewrote the database indexing architecture from scratch, line by line. Function by function, I bled every ounce of discipline and creativity I had into that code. By dawn, my eyes burned with grit and my fingers trembled as I compiled the final build. When I ran the performance tests, I watched processing speeds jump from 124 milliseconds to 36. Our bottleneck gone, data flowed clean, rapid, unbroken. I sat back in my chair, staring at the terminal, chest heaving. In the silence of that moment, broken only by the whir of cooling fans, I knew this was the pivot point. When Jacob arrived at the warehouse 2 hours later, he found me half asleep, chin resting on my chest. He shook me awake, blinking at the performance metrics on my screen. "Holy hell, Marcus, you just saved the company," he whispered. Oscar, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, grinned so wide it crinkled the corners of his face. "We're gonna be millionaires," he laughed, clapping me on the back so hard my teeth clicked. But I didn't think about money then. All I felt was quiet pride, a steady certainty that I had done the job right. I had built something that worked, something that mattered. In that dawn-lit warehouse, surrounded by discarded pizza boxes and humming servers, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The warning signs started small, like hairline cracks in old concrete. At first, I thought I was imagining it, Adrian Burke scheduling development meetings without including me, even though my fingerprints were on every core system we used. When I'd ask about updates on back-end refactoring priorities, he'd wave me off with a thin smile. "Focus on maintenance and bug fixes, Marcus," he'd say, eyes already moving past me to someone shinier. "Let the fresh talent drive innovation." Fresh talent, that was his favorite phrase. One morning, I walked into the conference room to find Tyler Graves leading a whiteboard session on modernizing back-end architecture for scalable growth. Tyler was 26, freshly graduated from Stanford's computer science program, his resume sprinkled with internships at glossy Silicon Valley firms. He'd been with us for barely 6 weeks. I sat in the back, arms crossed, listening to him propose a full migration to frameworks he didn't understand, suggesting AI features that sounded great in pitch decks but ignored the reality of our clients' needs. His ideas were impressive in theory, sleek, elegant, cutting edge, but he didn't know why certain structures existed in our database. He didn't know the silent battles fought under collapsing deadlines, or how I'd layered custom security protocols to protect legacy data still critical to small freight carriers. During the meeting, Adrian nodded along to every suggestion Tyler made, eyes gleaming with approval. The other new hires, clustered around the table, followed suit, scribbling notes like gospel. I felt the coldness return to my chest, coiling deeper this time, hardening into something heavy and unmovable. That night, I stayed in the office long after everyone left. The glow of my monitors lit the room in pale blues and greens as I began documenting everything. Every system specification, every custom solution, every hack and workaround I had built to keep our platform stable and efficient. I backed up critical files to my encrypted personal drives, not out of spite or sabotage, but because 3.5 years of watching startups implode had taught me one hard lesson: prepare for the worst-case scenario. Outside the tinted window, Tampa's skyline glowed under a humid midnight sky, neon signs flickering in the distance. Inside, I sat alone, typing command after command, archiving my life's work into folders labeled with dates and hidden meanings only I would understand. Each keystroke felt like laying bricks in a quiet fortress, not to attack, but to survive. The next morning, Adrian announced the upcoming launch celebration in his usual clipped, confident voice. He stood at the front of the open floor, flanked by Tyler Graves and the other new hires, all of them wearing Athenor Systems polos like a fresh marketing campaign. We're entering a new era, Adrian declared, his smile practiced and precise. This launch will cement our place as the industry leader in logistics data solutions. Applause rippled through the rows of desks. I clapped too, mechanically, feeling the hollow echo of my palms slapping together. As the team buzzed with excitement about media invites and client showcases, I turned back to my screen, the lines of code in my IDE swimming slightly from lack of sleep. I remembered joining Athenor Systems when it was nothing more than Jacob and Oscar huddled around a folding table, arguing over which cloud provider wouldn't bankrupt. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. The subject line read, "Team restructuring, effective immediately." At first, I assumed it was another generic corporate update about PTO policies or adjusted office hours during the upcoming launch week. I clicked it while sipping lukewarm coffee, eyes half focused on the deployment logs scrolling down my second monitor. But as I read each line, the words sharpened until they cut straight through my chest. As part of our ongoing efforts to streamline operations and position Athenor Systems for accelerated growth, we will be implementing strategic personnel changes. Your position has been eliminated effective today. Please coordinate with human resources regarding transition procedures and final compensation. No phone call, no private meeting, just a form letter addressed to Marcus Lane, as if I were a faceless contractor terminated after 3 weeks of underperformance. I sat in silence, staring at the lines of text that refused to rearrange themselves into something kinder, something more human. Outside my glass office walls, the team bustled with launch prep, oblivious. I felt each breath rattle in my chest like loose screws in a metal drawer. Slowly, I gathered my things, the half-burnt candle Oscar had gifted me our first holiday season, the worn notebook filled with system sketches and encryption formulas, the framed photo of Dad standing on a steel beam high above Tampa Bay. I placed them in my canvas messenger bag with methodical care, each motion deliberate, quiet, final. When I stood, my knees felt weak, like they had forgotten how to hold me upright. For a moment, I considered walking down the hallway to Adrian's corner office, demanding an explanation, some shred of dignity to wrap around this humiliation. But then I saw him through the glass wall, gesturing confidently to Tyler and 2 others, his smile wide, his voice carrying phrases like next-gen retooling strategy and legacy system offboarding. I realized in that moment there would be no explanation. In his eyes, I was already gone, just an outdated part removed from the assembly line to make room for fresh talent. I walked out of the building without a word, the Florida humidity wrapping around me like a damp blanket. Sitting in my car, I reread the email 3 more times, hoping it would soften or blur, but it never did. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked as hollow as I felt, a man who had spent 3.5 years building a foundation sturdy enough to hold a company's dreams, only to be discarded for someone with shinier credentials and market-ready buzzwords. I drove home with the radio off, the quiet cabin of my truck filled only with the hum of tires against asphalt and the distant rumble of early morning delivery trucks merging onto the highway. Each passing mile felt numb, unreal, as if I were floating somewhere just above my own life, watching it unravel. When I got home, I set my bag on the kitchen counter and walked straight to the worn oak desk in the corner of my living room. I opened my laptop, its familiar scuffs and chipped corners grounding me for a brief moment. My fingers moved automatically, typing in passwords and 2-factor codes, until the contract file loaded on screen. The one I had signed nearly 4 years ago in Jacob's tiny living room, surrounded by stale pizza boxes and cans of generic energy drink. Back then, I barely read the terms. I was desperate for purpose after being laid off from Cloud Mosaic. All I cared about was building something real again, getting my hands back into the wires and code that made sense when everything else didn't. But now each line of legal jargon glowed with sudden clarity. Clause 14(3), intellectual property ownership, pre-employment contributions. Subsection B, all software, encryption algorithms, or proprietary code frameworks developed by the contractor prior to conversion to employee status remain the sole property of the contractor, unless expressly transferred under a separate acquisition agreement. My heart thumped slow and heavy. I scrolled further, searching for any addendum or override. Nothing. Jacob and Oscar had been so desperate to lock in my expertise back then, they had signed everything my attorney friends suggested to protect me. And in their optimism, they never amended it. I opened my archived folders, scanning through creation dates and metadata stamps. There it was, the original deployment key generation script, timestamped 6 months before my employment conversion. My custom encryption algorithms, each function line commented with my initials and system design notes. The dynamic API connectors I wrote on my old ThinkPad, built late at night under the rattling ceiling fan in my apartment's spare room. Legally, they belong to me, every core security protocol, every deployment gateway, every architecture skeleton holding up their flagship platform. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me. The cold heaviness that had sat in my chest since that meeting with Adrian began to shift, solidifying into something sharper. Not rage, not even revenge, just a quiet certainty. They had removed the one person who held the keys to everything they were celebrating. And in their rush to replace me with fresh talent and flashy buzzwords, they had never bothered to check whether they actually could. Friday arrived with a heavy humidity that pressed against the windows like damp hands. That evening, Athenor Systems held their long-awaited launch celebration at the Clearwater Grand Pavilion, a modern glass-walled event center overlooking the Gulf. Invitations had gone out to investors, major clients, and media outlets weeks in advance. My name, of course, was nowhere on the list, but that didn't matter. I put on my best charcoal gray suit, the one I'd worn to my dad's funeral 2 years before, and drove down the coastal highway under a bruised purple sunset. As I pulled into the packed parking lot, I felt the cold certainty settle deeper within me, a quiet echo of every dawn I'd spent alone fixing their broken code. Inside, the pavilion buzzed with curated celebration. Hundreds of people mingled in tailored suits and glittering cocktail dresses, sipping champagne from thin crystal flutes. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd carrying silver trays topped with miniature crab cakes and smoked salmon canapés. Large banners hung from the ceiling beams, printed with phrases like Innovation Unleashed and Empowering Next-Gen Logistics. At the far end of the hall, a massive LED screen cycled through promo videos showing streamlined user dashboards and glowing testimonials from satisfied beta clients. The soundtrack was hopeful, triumphant, inspiring confidence in people who measured life in quarterly earnings. Near the stage, I spotted Adrian Burke holding court among investors, gesturing with expansive, casual ease. Tyler Graves stood just behind him, laughing too hard at something Adrian said, his bright eyes darting across the room as if searching for another person to impress. I walked through the crowd, unnoticed at first. After all, I'd spent years here in plain sight, blending into server rooms and back offices while executives soaked up the spotlight. My badge still worked. Security guards glanced at it and nodded me through. Nobody questioned my presence, nobody thought twice. I moved to the side of the stage, close enough to see the subtle flicker in the massive screen's corner, the cached demo feed looping flawlessly. My chest tightened with a quiet ache. I remembered writing the pipeline they were showcasing, alone at 3 a.m. with half-dead coffee beside me and a throbbing headache that wouldn't quit. I remembered the relief that had spread through my bones when the tests returned green across the board, confirming it was ready for real-world load. Now, watching Adrian step onto the stage, gripping the wireless mic with calm authority, I felt that memory turned bittersweet. He raised his free hand for silence, his smile growing wider as the room dimmed and the spotlight pinned him in clean, triumphant light. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and confident, echoing off the glass walls, "tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter for Athenor Systems. The chapter where we finally shed the limits of the past and embrace the future we were meant to build." Applause rippled through the crowd like a carefully rehearsed wave. I stood there, invisible at the edge of their vision, feeling my pulse slow and steady, each beat a reminder that this future they celebrated was rooted in code they no longer understood, code they no longer owned. I stood near the back of the main presentation hall as Adrian's speech rolled on, each word perfectly engineered to stroke investor confidence. His slides flipped in crisp succession. Growth projections, expansion plans, and client acquisition funnels. But the slide that caught my attention was the live demonstration feed. Behind him, the massive LED screen showed Athenor's platform processing thousands of data transactions in real time. Bright lines of analytics streamed upward in glowing bars, each one a silent boast of speed and security. The audience watched with rapt attention, nodding as if they understood the algorithms making it all possible. Adrian paused, surveying the crowd with calculated humility. "This," he said, gesturing at the radiant screen, "is what 3 years of focused innovation can achieve. We've moved beyond outdated infrastructures. Beyond the old ways that slowed us down." Outdated infrastructures, I almost laughed. That system he was showing off, every encryption protocol, every custom deployment framework, had been built by my hands in the flickering fluorescent silence of dawnlit server rooms. But none of them knew that. To them, Adrian was the architect, Tyler the bright apprentice, and I was a ghost no one remembered. The room hushed as Adrian reached under the podium and lifted a sleek black box wrapped in silver ribbon. "Tonight," he continued, his voice lowering theatrically, "we celebrate freedom, freedom from what once held us back." He unwrapped the ribbon and opened the box to reveal a single USB drive resting on black velvet. The cameras zoomed in, projecting its image onto the towering screen behind him. On its matte label, printed in clean block letters, were the words, "Athenor Systems Production Deployment Key." I watched his brow crease in confusion. He glanced down at the USB, then back up at the silent crowd, and for the first time all evening his voice faltered. What is this?" he asked, though his mic was still on, amplifying his uncertainty through the vast glass hall. From the shadows, I stepped forward into the dim aisle light, the eyes of a few guests tracking my movement. Adrian's gaze found mine. His confusion deepened into something darker, recognition mixed with fear. I spoke softly, but in the silent hall my words carried. "It's exactly what it says, Adrian, the master encryption key, the one thing you need to make your revolutionary platform actually work." For a beat, no one moved. Then the demo screen behind him flickered once, twice, and went black. A thin electronic whine filled the room as cooling fans slowed under emergency shutdown protocols. The silence that followed felt total, utter. The hum of the servers vanished. Dozens of tablets and laptops throughout the audience suddenly flashed connection errors. The seamless, unstoppable future Adrian promised now lay suspended in the void of my withheld code. Adrian looked down at the USB drive in his trembling hand, then back at me. In his eyes, I saw the truth settle in, heavy, undeniable, irreversible. The silence in the hall shattered as whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire from row to row. Investors leaned toward each other, brows furrowed, demanding explanations their assistants couldn't provide. Journalists began typing furiously, sensing the collapse of a story that only minutes before had been framed as triumph. On stage, Adrian stood frozen. The USB drive felt heavy in his shaking hand, his thumb brushing against the matte label again and again, as if hoping it would rewrite itself into something harmless. Tyler Graves rushed up the side steps, laptop open, eyes wide with panic. "It's not a network issue," Tyler whispered, though his voice carried enough for the front rows to hear. "The entire production environment is locked out. None of the backup credentials are working. Client accounts, everything is inaccessible." Adrian turned toward him, his expression desperate. "Fix it." Tyler shook his head, swallowing hard. "I can't. The encryption is custom built. I don't even understand half these protocols. They're not documented anywhere I can find." I watched the exchange from the foot of the stage, feeling the weight in my chest lighten, replaced by a deep, grounded calm. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just truth revealing itself like dawn rising over a dark horizon. The LED screens along the walls flickered in staggered collapse, each going black with an electronic sigh. Error messages bloomed across every device still connected to the presentation stream. Guests began standing, gathering their belongings with tight lips and darting eyes, as if proximity to failure might stain their tailored suits. Adrian's gaze snapped back to me. His voice cracked when he spoke, the microphone amplifying his fear to the entire room. "What did you do?" he whispered, though we both knew it wasn't about what I had done, it was about what he hadn't. I met his stare with a quiet steadiness. "I gave you exactly what you asked for, Adrian. Freedom from outdated infrastructure. Freedom from people who slow you down. Freedom from me." Tyler frantically typed lines of emergency commands into his terminal, the reflection of scrolling errors illuminating his pale face. Behind them, a group of board members conferred in hushed, urgent tones, their eyes darting between the darkened screens and the stunned audience. Security began to move toward me, unsure of their orders, but I remained where I was, hands at my sides, unmoving. There was no sabotage here, no threat, just a simple withdrawal of what was mine. The room, moments ago alive with curated celebration, now pulsed with a growing current of unease. I saw it dawn across the faces of investors and executives alike, that everything they thought they controlled had been built upon foundations they never bothered to understand. And in their arrogance, they had cut away the only person who did. I left the hall as quietly as I had entered. Security followed me only to the glass doors before stopping, their radios crackling with half-formed instructions from supervisors who still didn't know what exactly I had done. Outside, the Florida night wrapped around me, warm and heavy with sea salt drifting inland from the Gulf. In the parking lot, small clusters of guests stood in hushed circles, phone screens lighting their tense faces as they dialed partners, assistants, PR teams, anyone who could help them make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Some glanced at me as I walked past, recognition flickering in their eyes, but none moved to stop me. By the time I reached my truck, the calm certainty inside me had settled into something solid and immovable, not rage. Not triumph, just the quiet finality of knowing a story's end had been written long before tonight. Over the next week, events unfolded with the cold precision of inevitability. Tech blogs broke the story first: Athenor Systems, live demo disaster, platform failure halts $40 M launch. Investors began to withdraw commitments within hours of publication. Clients, terrified by the exposure of such vulnerability, canceled contracts worth millions. By Friday, the company's valuation had dropped by over 60%. My phone lit up every morning with calls from Adrian. First came polite requests to consult on an emergency basis. Then offers of lucrative freelance contracts to help stabilize the transition. When I didn't answer, his voicemails turned desperate, each message more frantic than the last, promising equity stakes and an immediate return to my previous role if I would just unlock the production servers. But I didn't reply. Instead, I spent that week speaking quietly with Jacob Tran, who still owned 40% of the company. He had watched Adrian's grandstanding with increasing unease, and the launch failure confirmed what he already suspected. With the support of 2 other board members, Jacob called an emergency vote on Friday. By noon, Adrian Burke was removed as Director of Operations. That afternoon, Jacob offered me Adrian's position. Director of Operations, plus equity that finally reflected the value of what I had built. I accepted under one condition: Tyler Graves and the others Adrian had brought in would stay. But from now on, they would learn the foundations before they rewrote them. On Monday morning, I entered my authentication keys. The servers unlocked with silent obedience, systems spinning up in smooth, effortless synchrony.